Late in the evening of September 26, 2015, two carjackers were brutally beating the owner of a truck at a gas station when a bystander with a firearm saw the incident occurring. Eager to help, the bystander opened fire at the two carjackers, unintentionally shooting the victim in the head. The two carjackers promptly fled in the victim's truck. According to a Gallup poll, a majority of Americans think owning firearms makes them safer. They believe good guys with guns will be able to defend themselves and others from bad guys with guns. This misconception could be a result of glamorizing firearms in movies, public relations campaigns from gun manufacturers, the acceptance of flawed academic research, or some combination of the three. Tragically, the reality is that having a gun in the home doubles the risk of homicide and triples the risk of suicide for the people living in that home. In this video, you will learn the role flawed academic research plays in perpetuating the myth that defensive gun use happens frequently, where this research comes from, why it is flawed, what current and accurate data collection reveals about the true number of defensive gun uses, and why debunking the myth of widespread defensive gun use matters. One of the reasons there is so much confusion around defensive gun use is because there are three main estimates that differ greatly. The first is a study conducted in 1993 by criminologists Dr. Gary Kleck and Mark Gertz. They asked 5,000 individuals whether they had used a firearm in self-defense over the past year. 66 indicated they had. The researchers then applied that sample to the total U.S. population and estimated that meant there are about 2.5 million annual incidences of defensive gun use. Other private surveys that use the same flawed methodology have produced similar estimates. These estimates are grossly overestimated, and we'll tell you why in just a minute. The second, which further research shows is also flawed, is the National Crime Victimization Survey, or NCVS, administered by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Having surveyed 135,000 households twice a year since 1973, the NCVS estimated that between 50,000 and 100,000 defensive gun uses occur annually, depending on the year. The third, and the most accurate, is from the Gun Violence Archive, which started collecting data in 2014 and uses more than 7,500 national media and police reports. It estimates that approximately 2,000 defensive gun uses occur annually. The Gun Violence Archive's estimate is the most accurate. By collecting reports, the database ensures that its estimates are verified and objective. The Gun Violence Archive maintains that if an incident is significant enough that a responsible gun owner fears for their life and determines a need to threaten lethal force, it is significant enough to report. What we're going to find is that both surveys from Kleck and the NCVS do not stand up to scrutiny like the Gun Violence Archive's data. First, let's talk about the false positive problem. Defensive gun use is statistically rare, with even the most extreme estimates, like those from Kleck and Gertz, indicating they happen to less than 2% of the U.S. population annually. While in a perfect world, those surveys would be able to capture the true number with a high degree of accuracy, in our messy reality, they have what are called false positives and false negatives, which occur when a person answers a question incorrectly or falsely. In surveys of common events, false positives and negatives typically cancel each other out. But because the Kleck and NCVS surveys focused on statistically rare events, defensive gun uses, false positives are likely to outweigh false negatives. This is important. Let's take a minute to understand what it means. People can claim to have experienced a defensive gun use in order to sound heroic or to justify their use of firearms, when in fact their defensive gun use was not legal or legitimate, or they made up their experience. Those are false positives, and they're a product of what's called social desirability bias. What does that mean? They want to look good in the eyes of the interviewer. Others may have had a real defensive gun use, but it was outside the survey's time frame, a problem known as telescoping that also causes false positives. On the other hand, people can deny having experienced a defensive gun use, when in reality they did. Maybe they used an illegally owned gun, or the defensive gun use was criminal versus criminal, which would be socially undesirable. Others may be concerned that the government might find out they have guns if they report a defensive gun use to a surveyor. Those responses are false negatives. In short, more false positives lead a survey to overestimate defensive gun uses, while more false negatives result in the survey underestimating defensive gun uses. Both the CLEC and NCVS surveys suffer from the problem of false positives. Assuming that CLEC's estimate of 2.5 million annual defensive gun uses is correct, CLEC's own research demonstrates that the false negative rate would have to be 135 times larger than the false positive rate in order to not overestimate. Assuming the NCVS's estimate of 50,000 annual defensive gun uses is correct, the false negative rate would have to be almost 5,000 times larger than the false positive rate to not overestimate defensive gun uses. Okay, so that is the false positive problem in a nutshell. We know it's a lot to digest, so we made another video explaining this in more detail. You can watch that next, but for now, back to defensive gun uses. Second, another way we can check for sound survey methodology is through external validation. External validation is applying the conclusions of a scientific study outside the context of that study. Let's apply CLEC's numbers to the known data. CLEC concludes that guns were used offensively in 845,000 out of the estimated 1.3 million burglaries that occurred in the U.S. during the survey's timeframe. Of those burglaries, 1/3 of the people were awake at the time of the burglary. Of that third, 42% owned firearms. Simple math clearly shows that the highest possible number of defensive gun uses can only be 182,000, and that is only if burglars targeted only households that owned firearms, and those gun owners used guns in self-defense every time they were awake. 182,000 is not remotely close to the 845,000 claimed by CLEC, so CLEC's estimates are mathematically impossible. CLEC's research also indicates that 207,000 criminals are shot every year by law-abiding citizens, yet this number is higher than the total number of people shot annually, which includes suicides and accidental shootings. CLEC insists, with no medical knowledge and without citing a single study, that the vast majority of these supposed criminals never seek hospital treatment. This is false, as shown in a 1999 study where researchers found that over 90% of criminals who had been shot went to a hospital for treatment before they were incarcerated. Now we'll talk about the Gun Violence Archive's estimate of 2,000 annual defensive gun uses. While this estimate is most likely an undercount since not every defensive use is reported, it is likely closest to the true number. The Gun Violence Archive's data doesn't distinguish legal or legitimate gun ownership, or note if the defensive gun use successfully stopped or prevented a crime, so it would be fair to assume that the defensive gun uses missing from the Gun Violence Archive's data, that is, the defensive gun uses that go unreported, are either illegal gun uses or cases where an irresponsible gun owner failed to report a dangerous criminal to the police. As you can see, the number of annual defensive gun uses is actually quite small, somewhere around 2,000 per year. In comparison, 39,773 people were killed by firearms in 2017. Tens of thousands more were injured. More than 200,000 firearms were stolen, and that's before counting the hundreds of thousands of estimated other abusive uses of firearms like brandishing, harassment, and threats. All of this evidence demonstrates that guns are used far more often to harm than to protect. So what's the importance of all this? Simply stated, the conclusions from CLEC's research that are often used to make the case for defensive gun use do not rely on credible data, and the NCVS data on defensive gun uses is also fatally flawed. The conclusions provided by CLEC and NCVS have been used to create or support dangerous public policy, like open carry, permitless carry, and stand your ground laws. They persuade people to buy firearms, sometimes with tragic results. Widespread defensive gun use is a myth, and the best available academic evidence shows that the resulting policies from belief in that myth are linked to higher rates of gun violence. Gun buyers and those who make public policy must have reliable, accurate data to make informed decisions about safety. More guns simply does not mean less crime. 60% of Americans believe that guns will make them safer, when in reality, according to Dr. David Hemingway of Harvard, the average person will have basically no chance to use a gun in self-defense. The reality is that a firearm in the home doubles risk of homicide and triples risk of suicide. To learn more, visit www.gvpedia.org.